mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jenny Jung from CECP and representing the Data Insights team for an exciting follow-up webinar to our Giving in Numbers report. For those who joined our first webinar, you'll be familiar with our interview style. And again, today I've got my esteemed colleague and lead report author of the report, Andre Solorzano.
Hello, Jeannie. It's a pleasure to be here again.
I am having a bit of a technical issue, so for those who are joining, please hang on while I can share the screen. All right, apologies about that. Hold up. So I've got the screen share up and running. If you're not able to see, send us a quick chat. And then Andre, again, welcome to our webinar.
It's great to be able to share more insights from Giving Numbers.
And I know that we've got a lot of great insights that you've already prepared for us, so we will get to that. But for just a little bit of housekeeping, so for those who might have questions, in your GoToWebinar box on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see an option that says questions. So feel free to type your questions as we go through the webinar. If we do not have a chance to answer all of them, Andre and I will follow up individually to make sure your questions are addressed, or if there's anything that was unclear, we can make sure that's done. You can also download a copy of our Giving in Numbers report on CECP's website. That's cecp.co/GIN. And then for those who might have missed the first webinar or wanted to be a refresher on what we had discussed, you can actually find that on CECP's website or by visiting CECP's YouTube channel. So it's the latest video there, really easy to find. And Andre, I know that the hard copies should have arrived to all of our survey participants. For those who would like a hard copy, you can certainly ask us and we'll mail you one, but of course the quickest way will be visiting our website. Now, it's been a couple weeks since the report has been released. How has life changed for you?
Well, significantly. I've already booked a flight to Seychelles.
Oh, okay.
No. The work still continues.
Yeah, and then I did confirm with Andre that if anyone wanted an autographed copy of the report, just let us know. We can drop that in the mail for you. So with that, let's advance to our next slide. Just a reminder about who we are and why we're doing this, and we're of course so excited that all of you are able to join. We've got a photo of our founding co-chair, Paul Newman, and this quote really does explain a lot of the work that we're doing. It may be repetitive for those who are already familiar with CECP, but it will make sense as we talk about some of the topics such as measurement and engaging employees, and about corporations being a force for good. As we go through this, a question that we pose to those who are attending is, how are you serving as a force for good in your role? Is it through measurement? Is it through doing the best that you can with your corporation's social strategies? And then, of course, keeping in mind, how is this playing into the way your team or your company is working towards, hopefully, a mission to also be a corporation and a force for good? Both Andre and I are part of the data insights team. It's kind of an evolution where we help companies collect data. We help them compare. Companies can use that information to evaluate and then share it out, one of which is through this survey that happens every year, and then it culminates in a final report. So this is an overview of our first webinar, but I think it would just be helpful to do a reminder of what the report is about, who is in it, what is an overview of that.
Exactly. It's important to have a context of where the survey comes from. And this year we had 258 companies of the world's largest corporations who participated in our survey and filled out various questions related to corporate societal engagement. Their contributions added up to $21 billion. This is equivalent to the gross domestic product of a middle-income country. So there's a significant amount of societal investment out there. And this research happened in the spring of this year. As you may be familiar, it started in January throughout the spring and collected data about corporate societal engagement. This covers topics such as employee engagement, volunteering, matching gifts, measurement of outcomes, etc. And I am pleased to mention that we've been working with the conference board, with our friends from the conference board since 2001, and the data we collect for giving numbers has been retrieved since 2001. So there's a long-standing story of collecting corporate societal engagement data.
Yeah, and I know that we really enjoy, I know as a colleague in the data insights team, we enjoy knowing that legacy behind this 15-year plus history of how companies are measuring and changing. And then there's another aspect that you'll be discussing through some of these data slides, which is applying a CECP standard of rigor with a 3-year match set.
Exactly. When we want to compare long-term or when we want to compare several years, we want to make sure we compare the same companies. So that's, for instance, what we call a 3-year match set. When we want to compare the trends of the last 3 years, we make sure we only include those companies who have participated and provided the data for each of those 3 years in order to be able to compare apples with apples.
And then when we get to our first 3-year match set, I'll be sure to just bring it up again. And then you also apply to ensure that it is inflation adjusted.
Exactly, to make sure the prices are included into the figures of total giving and monetary values.
Right, so really important in terms of economics and ensuring that it's an apples-to-apples benchmarking. So for those who joined that first webinar, this should look familiar. This was our agenda from the first webinar. And if you recall, you all had voted on the topics for today's webinar. So the most popular was
measurement of outcomes.
And we'll be spending a good amount of time on this topic, followed by volunteering. So this is, of course, employee volunteerism.
Exactly.
And then followed by program areas. So more to come. And I see that folks are typing in questions. Please continue. We will make sure to address them as we get to those appropriate slides. So let's begin with the measurement of outcomes and impacts. Now, before we go into some of the excellent analysis that you've done, tell us about what outcomes and impacts are. And it is, of course, tied to the logic model. I think it might be helpful just to break it down to make sure we're all starting with the same knowledge of it.
Exactly. This question asks respondents whether they measure outcomes or impacts. So this is really important to distinguish what an outcome is and how it is different from impact. Outcomes refers to specific changes in programs. For instance, changes in a program, in the participants' behavior, a change in knowledge among participants, changes in skills, status. For an example would be the percentage of children and pregnant women sleeping under a bed net. For instance, that's a change in the behavior. And outcome, and that's outcome. And impact, I would define it as a more ultimate or more long-standing change in the behavior. We define it as the change occurring in organizations, communities, or systems as a result of program activities in the long term. For instance, an example would be, as we saw first, we had the outcome of the percentage of children and pregnant women sleeping under a bed net, but the impact would be the decrease in malaria-related mortality levels. So it's a more ultimate change in behavior.
Right, and so that's a really great explanation, because we know that companies are answering questions in our annual report on this, and we just want to make sure for those who are joining, you understand the background for how these responses are being captured. So outcomes, change in usage or behavior, impacts, a bit more longer term, and thinking bigger,
Exactly.
bigger picture. So with that, let's go into the first data slide that you provided. I know that this is you've got some information that came from two different questions. One was, are you measuring outcomes and or impacts? Mm-hmm. And then if yes, tell us what type of grant. So tell us what we're looking at in terms of this gray pie chart.
Yeah, the first pie chart asks, is the reflection of the question of which levels of the logic model do companies actually currently measure. So in this case, we know that 81% of companies said that they were measuring outcomes and or impacts. So that also gives us a 19% of companies who said that they were not measuring either outcomes or impacts.
And we appreciate that, that honesty, saying, not all companies are in that level or have the ability to measure. But also good news that there is an 81%, so overwhelming majority who are saying, yes, we are measuring these outcomes and impacts of these programs.
Yeah, among those who measure outcomes and impacts, there are different levels of scope of measurement. As we can see from the orange portion of the second pie chart, we see different levels of measurement on just selected grants. So in this case, the measurement happens on just a strategic flagship program, or it can happen on programs that are above a certain threshold, or programs related to a specific cost area. And on the other side, we have the blue portion of the pie chart, which has the scope of measurement called all grants. Basically, this is saying that companies measured outcomes and their impacts on all their grants. So we can see the orange section of the pie chart refers to measurement on just different types of selected grants, and the blue portion reflects measurement on all grants.
And this pie chart is insightful because we understand that measuring everything might not be the right way or right approach for every company. And we're seeing this diversity of how companies are approaching measurement. So whether it is, like you're saying, a cause area or perhaps a threshold, so grants that only meet a certain amount and higher will undergo the scrutiny of measurement in outcomes and or impact.
Exactly. This scope of measurement can vary across companies, since companies have different levels of resources and time that they can allocate into measurement. Some companies will be able to allocate more resources and measure all grants, and some others will not be able to do so. And that's where we see all the other types of scopes of measurement.
In the yellow box that's highlighted, strategic programs, so 38% of companies are saying that they're applying this level of measurement to just the strategic program. How is CECP identifying that?
Yeah, so a strategic program is that program in which a company applies more of their resources in terms of measurement. That's what a strategic program is. It's the program in which a company invests more of their resources in terms of measurement.
Okay, and so 38 is a good amount. Now, there's another data point that you also did pull up where you compared all of the orange components of this pie chart versus the blue. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, when companies measure their societal outcomes and their impacts on just selected grants, we saw that they were able to attain more grantees or more beneficiaries. The median number of grantees for those companies that measured just on selected grants was 415. That was higher as opposed to the case of companies that measured outcomes on all their grants. The number of grantees or beneficiaries was way less. It was 133 for those companies. Also, in terms of the grants they gave, that number was higher for companies that were able to measure just on selected grants, as opposed to those companies that had to measure every single grant they disbursed. The median number of grants for those companies was 176.
And so that's interesting because we can interpret this possibly by saying companies who are able to apply a measurement across all of their grants are able to do so because the numbers are lower. Exactly. Perhaps it's a little more manageable.
Exactly.
And then for those who are following along with the copy of the report or the digital version on your screen, you can refer to pages 25 to 27 to read a little bit more about this. So now we want to take a quick break and ask the audience to join us in a poll question. So we are interested in learning, what is your biggest internal driving force for measuring your program or programs? Is it your CEO or other senior executives? Is it an internal team or perhaps your internal department leaders? Is it employees or four other internal stakeholders? So we see responses coming in. Andre, any predictions?
I'm predicting number one.
Number one, CEO and other senior executives. As we wait for additional responses, CEOs are interesting because CECP was founded on a mission focusing on the CEO audience.
Exactly.
Okay, so I will be closing the poll. Oh, we've got some additional responses coming in. So let's close that and let me share the results. We've got 67% of attendees today saying it is their CEO and other senior executives that are serving as the internal driving force. We've got a third, 33, saying internal team or department. None for employees and none for other internal stakeholders.
So it sounds like it's a combination of both with more weight on the CEOs and the C-suite.
And in some ways, we know that that is the way that we're seeing it. We've also heard from CEOs that they actually place a lot of value on their employees. So it'll be interesting when we do a counter poll with CEOs in the future. So with that, let me go back to sharing my screen. And let's proceed with our next slide. So one big headline, one of the many big headlines for the report was that measurement was increasing and everyone was excited.
Yes.
Now tell us why we should be excited.
Here we apply the same concept of a three-year match. We're comparing basically the same companies that provided information about measurement of outcomes for each of the last 3 years. And we saw that the percentage of measurement of outcomes increased by 2 percentage points. It went from 85% in 2014 to 87% in 2016. This, again, consists of just companies that have provided this type of data in each of those 3 years.
And so that 2 percentage points, can you just explain that again, just to make sure everyone is aware?
Yes, percentage points refers to the difference in the percentages. In this case, 87% minus 85%. It's different from a growth rate. This basically just refers to the difference in percentage points between 2 points in time, in this case 2014 and 2016.
So this is where we see that level of rigor that you've applied in your analysis. 184 companies, we're following them through time, through a 3-year time period and saying, well, this is what it looks like in 2014. Let's fast forward for 2016. Also, you write about this on pages 25 to 27. So for folks joining, please feel free to refer to that for additional information.
Exactly. We also wanted to know what type of scope of measurement they were having. We were also interested in seeing the trends in terms of the changes in scope of measurement. And we saw that those companies that claimed they were doing the measurement on just their strategic flagship program went from 32% in 2014 to 38% in 2016. So that was an increase of 6 percentage points, which was higher than what we saw in terms of measuring all brands. As we can see following this one, we saw that 16% of companies stated that they measured outcomes and impacts on all their brands in 2014, but this number increased by 2 percentage points in 2016. The increase was not as high as those companies that stated they did the measurement on their strategic programs.
And then the strategic program, again, we ask companies to report that, saying a strategic program is defined as a program where the company spends the most time, money, and or management resources. So that's one way to think about how a strategic program may mean differently for different companies. So interesting data on this 3-year match set. Now, another slide on evaluation and measurement is that CECP so often hear from companies asking, how do we make a business case for employee engagement? CECP has built at least one annual summit as well as several events surrounding this topic. And our summit, of course, occurs in May every year for our affiliated community members. And then we know that the making a case is so intricately tied to measuring a value, specifically a business value. So tell us a little bit more about this chart between I see the yes and the no's here.
Yes, basically we have the median revenue of companies that perform measurement of the business value of employee engagement programs, and we saw that those companies that measure the business value of employee programs had a slightly higher median revenue. It was 17 billion, and those companies that did not measure the business value of their employee engagement programs had a slightly lower median revenue of $16 billion. So that could also imply that companies with more resources are also able to perform a measurement of the business value of their engagement programs.
And then, so this is the median revenue of a data set of 237 companies. Mm-hmm. But you also do explain that it's tied to total giving.
Yes, I think it's the median revenue is it's not as important as the outcome in terms of the increase or trend of volunteer participation rates. We saw that those companies that took the time and the resources to measure the business value of their employee engagement programs had a higher volunteer participation rate of their employees of 37% compared to those companies that did not measure the business value of their employee engagement programs with just 28% of volunteer participation rates.
And then I know that you've done some analysis that's not shown on the screen, but talking about, again, applying that 3-year match set and saying companies who were measuring both social outcomes and or impacts and measured the business value saw a total giving change increase for 22%. So
exactly.
22%, and this is accounting for inflation.
Exactly, and those companies that just did the measurement of just their social outcomes and their impacts, they basically had no change in their total giving, as opposed to those companies that had both types of measurement, not only for social outcomes of their programs, but also in terms of employee engagement. And what this is telling us is that maybe companies, after performing the measurement of business value of employee engagement programs, they're able to understand the sense of purpose of their employees and address and maximize the donations or the volunteer hours of their employees.
So even more reason to measure, right? Because we're seeing higher revenues, higher total giving, higher rates of employee engagement and volunteer participation. Now, we're talking about measuring the business value, and CECP does actually collect really interesting information every year about how companies are measuring. So can you just share a couple of examples with the audience today?
Yes, companies measure the business value of employee engagement programs in different ways through obtaining rates or scores of satisfaction of employees. Yeah, it's basically a tracking of employee satisfaction. Also, they measure what type of skills employees learned when did all these employee engagement opportunities. Also, they measure the brand reputation among those communities that were served when employees volunteered.
So again, just more companies need to measure. And those were some examples. CECP's report, actually page 28 also includes some examples here. So I know that the reference here says 25 to 27. 28 also has some information. And as a bonus, I have a screenshot of our other long-standing CECP report called Measuring the Value of Corporate Philanthropy. So this is from 2010, but a lot of the information is relevant. And as a special treat, we have uploaded the document as a handout for the webinar. So if you go to your GoToWebinar chat function or the text function on the right-hand side of your screen, if you click on the handouts, you will see it. So it is about a 100+ page report, but just a short summary is that this report talks about what are the current practices and measurement trends, helping audiences identify what is actually needed in terms of impact evidence, because we know that evidence needs to be collected, and then sharing some practical steps on how to move forward. A key hallmark, and a hallmark of this report is that it actually breaks down how to have different conversations about measurement depending on the audience. So there are three audiences here that the report does lay out. One is between grant recipients and their corporate funders, what we call chief giving officer. The second audience is between that CGO, chief giving officer, and the CEO. And the third is between the CEO and the investor community. So, Andre, as you know, with even the report and your analysis, depending on the audience, it does need to be tweaked a bit.
Yeah, that's an excellent overview of measuring the value of corporate philanthropy. It's a really important tool our corporation staff can also use in terms of measuring the different impacts of their societal engagement programs.
And so, yeah, we encourage everyone to take a quick read or perhaps use it as a nighttime reading filled with many resources and information within that report. So having said that, let's move over to a different slide on measurement. Andre, when you and I discussed this particular slide, there are some really interesting headlines here, but one was that you described it as companies require more experienced staff when measuring the outcomes of all grants. So let me repeat that. Companies require more experienced staff when measuring outcomes of all grants. Explain to us what that means.
Yes, this is a matter of applying resources in terms of measurement. We saw that when companies measure the societal outcomes on just specific selected grants, the amount of experience or the time of experience of their staff was lower than in those cases when companies had to measure the outcomes or impacts of all their grants. In order to be able to measure all grants, companies required a more experienced staff. We can see that the percentages for the lower portion of the bar chart, the 34 plus 43% is higher than the 42 plus 22% in the upper bar. So in other words, companies that measure the outcomes on all their grants require more experienced employees that measure them.
So with the top line, the only specific grants, if we think back to that pie chart that we had as our first analysis slide, it's the orange aspect. So all of the different orange slices of that pie, and the all grants would be that 18%,
exactly.
That blue section of the pie.
Exactly.
So with that, let's move on to our second poll question, because we would like to hear from you. What do you consider the best method to improve your company's measurement of social programs? So 4 options on your screen right now. Please do vote. Only one selection is allowed. Do you consider the best method to be 1, increase internal expertise? Is it 2, identifying appropriate external frameworks? Is it 3, developing a customized internal framework? Or 4, is it other? And if you are selecting other, let us know. What are some best methods? Maybe you've considered it. Maybe your team is currently utilizing it. So we like to hear from you. Responses are coming in. Andre, if you were in the shoes of one of our audience members, what do you think would be the best method?
I would like to have an internal framework.
Internal framework. Okay. I would say if budget and money and resources were not an issue, I would just hire a team of measurement experts.
That's a good guess.
So with that, let's close the poll and see what the responses are. So we see that 50% is saying developing a customized internal framework. So Andre, you were right. But I was not too far with 38% increasing internal expertise. And we do see 13% saying identifying appropriate external frameworks, which actually makes sense because it's not recreating something if you know that there is one that fits out there.
Exactly.
Now, although we would assume the third option is possibly because we know some programs are complex and require a lot more knowledge.
Yeah, it sounds like it's about bringing the in-house knowledge, bringing it in the house.
Okay, and with that, if you have additional questions on the measurement component, please type them in. We will try our best to get them answered before the end of the webinar. But for now, we are going to proceed to the next topic that was voted by the audience members of our first webinar, employee volunteerism?
Here we have a comparison across industries in which we see the median of hours per employee that were volunteer, and we see how it varies across industries. And we see that industries such as energy, communications, financials, and technology have higher rates of volunteer hours per employee. Employees from these industries may benefit from well-established on-company time volunteer policies and also may have certain particular skills that are desired by nonprofit beneficiaries.
So to remind those who have not, or to let others know who have not yet maybe made it to page 17 of this excellent report, the headline here is that employee volunteerism is on the rise. So CECP is able to measure various ways of engagement. We look at the number of programs being offered, we look at the percentage of employees or the workforce who is being engaged, and in this slide, you're talking about the median number of hours per employee. You've already calculated the size of these companies by industry level.
Exactly, it varies, but the overall message across the board is that employee engagement in terms of the number of or the percentage of participation rate has been increasing over the course of the last 3 years, and this varies across industries.
And for those who might be looking at this, because it is in descending order of median hours per employee, if you are a company in, let's say, the healthcare industry, we hope that you do not feel despaired about that low number, because this is also a median. So we know that there are outliers.
Are fluctuations there.
And so just to clarify for the audience, we've got a question coming. How are we identifying the industries?
So we identified the industries based on the Bloomberg Industry Classification Standard. We have 9 industries that are categorized based on the types of services and products they specialize in.
And then from the first webinar, just because I find it relevant for what we are talking today, you've talked about the percentage, you focus on the percentage of employees who volunteer. How are companies measuring this? So tell us how companies can measure. How do you know if you're leading?
If you're leading, you can apply the measurement of the top quartile. That's an important benchmarking we have. We know from our research in 2016 that the average volunteer participation rate was 31%. And in order to be in that cutoff point, to be part of the top 25% of companies, employees should have volunteered at least in the 44%.
So in summary, really, there are tons of metrics. So there's actually a variety of benchmarks to use for companies to identify how are we doing, answering that question. As you can see on the screen, by looking at industry is one. We've already spoken about how there's an upward trend. So if your company is not increasing the employee engagement rate, then there's an opportunity there. And then, as you mentioned, this top quartile is also another way to benchmark yourself.
Yes, in order to be part of that top quartile, at least 44% of your employees have to have volunteer at least 1 hour on company time.
And that's incredible to think about. The companies who are in our data set, they are multi-billion-dollar companies with hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of employees across the globe. So to engage even 44%, that's truly a commendable.
The potential is big, yes.
Mm-hmm. So with that, let's move on to a related and very interesting finding. Companies are obviously seeing all different types of volunteer offerings. And so we do talk about that in the first webinar. And it's no surprise that everyone wants to increase how many they offer to their employees. But you have an interesting data point that shows offering as many as you can in terms of number of programs may not actually benefit the company or the employees. So tell us why the phrase lucky 7 is relevant here.
Yeah, it's what in economics they call diminishing returns. We cannot expect that companies can offer an infinite number of types of volunteer programs, domestically speaking, and still keep increasing the volunteer participation rate. We saw that there's a cutoff point, that when companies offer around 7 types of domestic volunteer programs, that's the point from which the volunteer participation rate starts decreasing. we can see, for instance, with that when companies offered 7 types of domestic volunteer programs, the participation rate of their employees was 42%. And then after this cutoff point, the volunteer participation rate starts decreasing constantly.
Okay, yeah, so I see that with 9, there is a slight up, but even still, when you're thinking about the trajectory of offering 1 through 7 programs, I mean, this is notable for companies.
Yeah, so we can say that there's a sweet spot in terms of the number of types of programs companies can offer in order to maximize the participation of their employees.
And so this is just domestic volunteer programs. So stated in another way, companies are reporting the percentage of employee participation to just the domestic workforce. And this is significant because, as we can see in the footnote, this is a data set comprised of 155 companies.
Exactly, we have enough representation.
And so with these different types of volunteer programs, remind the audience what type of volunteer programs exist out there.
We have different types of volunteer programs, such as flexible scheduling, company-wide day of service. We also have retirees, sabbatical volunteering. We also have many others as well.
So this is really also giving good reason to think about the type of volunteer programs offered, but to whom? You know, engaging your employees, maybe your part-time employees, engaging your retiree community. So all very important in thinking about how to increase this volunteer participation and employee engagement overall.
The scope or the range in which companies can engage their employees through volunteer programs varies. We have different types of volunteer programs such as Dollars for Doers, Family Volunteer, Pro Bono Services, Board Leadership, etc.
And then, so here's also what's interesting, because we know there's a desire to do more, and that's actually a good thing in this instance here. But as with the number of program offerings, you've also seen in the data that there's a trend with the type of program offerings as well. So we just mentioned, you know, you just ran down the list of different types of programs, but there's a very interesting data point here that serves as a reminder for what is a powerful combination in program offerings. So tell us a little bit more about what we are looking at in the screen here.
Exactly. What we have here is that combination or that synergy between or among those companies that offer both types of volunteer programs that have some type of flexibility in terms of employees' schedule. In this case, we have the average volunteer participation rate among those companies that offer both paid release time and also flexible scheduling. Those companies attained a really high volunteer participation rate of almost 36%. And when we asked or calculated what was the average number of types of volunteer programs, that number was 6.9. If you can remember, it's pretty similar from the number we just saw before.
The lucky 7.
The lucky 7, exactly.
And then you've got here a twist to that first data point.
Exactly. Here we have companies that offer not both types of programs that have this flexibility in terms of employee schedules, but only one of the two. So we saw that the volunteer participation rate was 28.7% for these companies, and the number of volunteer programs offered was lower, 4.7. So these companies didn't attain the same volunteer participation rate or something as high as the previous one.
And we're just getting a quick question to clarify how those two programs are identified. Paid release time, CECP actually refers to it as either on company time or volunteer time off. Each company will have a different way of describing it, but it includes and allows companies to report the time spent by employees during a normal paid work schedule. So whether that's a Monday through Friday or whatever it might be, and when that employee is donating time to a qualified recipient, and of course it has to be within corporate policies, that would be considered a paid release time. Flexible scheduling is a little different because it allows an employee to perhaps leave work early, come into work a little bit late, to allow for him or her to work on a volunteer project or to do some volunteering, and without incurring any sort of loss of time for the employee with the assumption that they would be able to be flexible and make it up.
Oh yeah. In other words, with flexible scheduling, the employee has to compensate for the time this person used for volunteering, as opposed to paid release time.
So the first set of bar charts is when you looked at companies who offered both this paid release time and flexible scheduling. The second set of bar charts, you're looking at companies who reported to
Either
offer
one or the other.
either one. And then the third one you've got here.
That those consist of companies that do not offer any of this type of programs that have this flexibility in terms of employee schedules. And we saw that those companies have lower participation rates in terms of volunteering and also a fewer number of types of programs, domestically speaking.
So that's very interesting. So we kind of see this downward trajectory. I mean, I know that it is the way that you did your report and the slide here, but it is actually very insightful for the teams out there to think about how to strategize on what's the best combination of employee engagement opportunities. And with that, let's go into our third quick poll. So we just want to make sure that we are on a good track and that this is helpful. Let us know how likely are you to recommend this webinar to a colleague at another company. So 9 to 10, extremely likely. 1 to 2, not likely. We certainly hope there's more who are fans of our data.
What's your guess? Maybe an 11?
An 11. I think that would be an ambitious goal, but it'll be interesting. Okay, so with that, it looks like responses are still coming in. So I know that we've talked about measurement, we've talked about employee volunteerism. More of that was available in our first webinar. You write about that in the Giving Numbers report. CECP offers certain one-on-one data insights as well to affiliated companies. And then with program areas, it'll be interesting to see what you've got. So with that, let's just quickly close the poll and share. And so we've got 64% saying 7 to 8. So thank you for that. Not everyone was 11. Maybe next time.
But we have a 14% in the 9 to 10. So that's also good.
Well, thank you everyone for your feedback on that. So with that, we're entering our agenda component where we talk about program areas. For those who've read our press release and read the report and attended the webinar, everyone knows, hopefully by now, that there was a big headline with culture and arts.
Yes.
That has the biggest increase in terms of cash giving in the past 3 years. Do you recall the number of increase?
48%.
That is correct. So with that, I know that you provided a wider view of the different average breakdown that a company in our data set allocated to different program areas. So just explain these for us, please.
Yes, no major changes here in terms of the allocation of total giving. We saw that almost 3 out of $10 that were contributed by companies went to education. This is combining education K-12 to also higher education. So that represents around 30% of total giving went to these two causes. And it's followed by health and social services with 26% of total giving allocated into this program area. But what is interesting to see here is which industries actually were the biggest cash givers for each of the different program areas. And we saw that that is concentrated among, well, between two industries. In this case, communications was the biggest giver in terms of cash for civic and public affairs, for disaster relief, and for education. And on the other side, we have the consumer staples industry, which was the industry that gave more in terms of cash for culture and the arts, environment, and interestingly, health and social services. And this was actually the highest median of cash giving among industries. The consumer staples industry had a median cash giving to health and social services of $9.34 million, even higher than those companies in the healthcare industry.
So that's interesting because when we take a step back to that, just looking at the pie chart, you're saying in the data set, a typical company is allocating 20% of their total giving to health and social services.
Yes, 26% around, yeah.
And CECP, we actually do provide a chart that outlines the differences by industry and what the average breakdown is on page 12 of the report. So please do refer to that. But it's also interesting to also think about the two specific industries that have been headlines.
Yes.
So communications and consumer staples.
And we know for consumer staples, there's an increasing level of awareness among customers in terms of their well-being, eating healthy, using products that go along better with this type of mentality and care of the health of the people.
Also, another interesting thing is I want to bring attention to that disaster relief. So on average, back in 2016, companies allocated 2% to disaster relief. We will be talking about disaster relief in the next slide, and we know that with next year, we hope to see some interesting data come to us about this year's effort.
Yes, we foresee probably changes in the way companies allocate giving to disaster relief in next year's data collection.
So another 3-year math set that you've done where you've seen that the share of disaster relief has actually been going up in the past 3 years, and 7 out of 10 industries have increased it between 2014, 15, and 16.
Yes, relatively speaking, the percentage of giving that was allocated to disaster relief is still small, but we've seen increases in the share among 7 from the 10 industries we measure. We saw, for instance, that communications, consumer staples, financials, healthcare, industrials, technology, and utilities were industries that increased the share of disaster relief from total giving in a 3-year match set. Again, among those companies that were able to provide this breakdown of giving allocation in the last 3 years.
So again, we really do expect to, and we do anticipate to see how companies will change their information or their activities, and we look forward to all of your input for next year's report. With that, let's go over to our final poll of the webinar, and it is related to disaster relief. So given the number of recent natural disasters, and specifically, of course, in the U.S., but globally, as we know, that has been going up, how likely will your company increase next year's resources for disaster relief? Is it 1, not likely, all the way to 5, very likely? So we already know that with the number of disaster relief, with the number of natural disasters this calendar year, it was obviously unexpected, and companies had to really step up and say, how can we work with their communities? How can we work with those who are affected? It'll be interesting to see how companies will plan for that next year without knowing actually what type of natural disasters will be scheduled.
And given budget constraints as well.
So we've got votes coming in, so please take a second to click on your screen and let us know. I would hope that more companies are able to step up, but it could also mean that perhaps companies have mechanisms to be agile, to activate when needed.
Exactly, or keep the amount of giving in the same levels, which might have increased this year.
Okay, so let's go ahead and close the survey and share the results with everyone. So we've got a tie with the most popular answer. We've got a third of attendees saying not likely, and a third saying likely, and then 25. So 1 out of 4 of our attendees today are saying they're unsure. And then a smaller portion saying very likely, and even smaller saying not at all likely.
So basically 41% are somehow likely to increase their giving to disaster relief in the next year.
Yeah, so that will be very interesting. So thank you for your insights and inputs on that. With that, we are entering our question component. I know that we've got a couple of questions that were lined up. So we have a question asking to just go a little deeper into defining program type. We just spoke about disaster relief. How is CECP identifying disaster relief versus, let's say, health and social services?
Yes.
And while you look that up, I should let everyone know, as part of the second handout on this GoToWebinar, we have uploaded our annually updated valuation guidance. So this guidance that is available to you right now is what was used by the survey participants for the report, and we do expect to update that slightly, since it is updated every year to reflect the survey. So with that, Andre, just tell us a little bit more about disaster relief.
Yes, the survey asked respondents to quantify their giving and priorities by program type. The program type basically should reflect the category into which the ultimate end recipient of the contribution fits. Let's say, in other words, the purpose of giving when contributing to nonprofits. And in this particular case, disaster relief refers to contributions that support preparedness of relief, recovery, or rebuilding efforts in the wake of a natural or civil disaster or other emergency hardship situations.
And I know that CECP actually gets this question quite frequently.
Yes.
About how are we identifying these 9 categories of program types, and CECP actually really appreciates that question, because we know that the folks out there are paying attention to our valuation guidance. We do talk about it in our guidance report on pages 19 through 20, but the evolution of this is that it's based on a long-standing database called the Nonprofit Program Classification System. So there is a taxonomy on how all the nonprofit organizations in the U.S. are classified into different letter classifications. And from there, CECP was able to aggregate it into these 9 different categories. So when we talk about ensuring that your total giving is categorized by the intent of giving, so you are supporting a program to do X, Y, and Z, regardless of what that organization's primary mission might be, that's a good way to go. But if you are giving a general grant, and therefore you do not have an intent of a grant because it's an operating budget or operating grant, we advise that you go into the system and look it up, just so that we can ensure our data is streamlined. And it looks like we were able to answer some of the other questions that are coming in, or that have come in, excuse me, and it looks like we are good. Just a question about how do we learn more about measurement. So CECP does this annual report, of course, led by Andre, and we do have additional resources that we make available through our blogs. We do some white papers and periodic releases. Currently, CECP is working on different communities focused on different topics. So thinking about how to communicate and activate this process of employee engagement within your company, thinking about perhaps just the STEM-specific group, thinking about how to engage executives, especially in the C-suite, to make sure that they understand incorporating a culture of purpose, both that higher level as well as across the board with all employees. So if this is an area of interest, please do reach out to CECP. I think that a great starting point is reading that report. I mean, obviously, we're talking about it for a full hour, but really, the report is an excellent resource. Our valuation guidance will also be excellent, as well as that measuring the value report. Even though it is from 2010, it is actually one of our most highly regarded reports and analysis, because we do include some frameworks that a lot of companies and other sectors are referring to every day. So with that, I'd like to close by saying thank you so much for joining us. This webinar will be available on YouTube, and we will be sending out a follow-up email, and the PDF will be available as well online. Just a reminder to please participate in our Giving in Numbers survey. It launches in January 2018. You will be receiving an email from me, so thank you in advance for keeping an eye out for that. You can visit CECP's website to download reports. So, of course, our Giving in Numbers report, where you can actually benchmark against peer companies and industries. I should note at the back of that report, we list out which companies are categorized under which industry. So that will be a good reference. We didn't have a chance to talk about this today because it was not the focus, but thought that it would be great to know that we do have a parallel report also written by Andre Solorzano. To do that, you can log in to my CECP for some additional benchmarking tools.
And definitely there are many ways in which companies can collaborate and accelerate the movement and advance the movement. We can also mention we have our current initiative of what counts as in the ESG, which identifies other ways in which companies are contributing to society besides and beyond the typical categories we have always included in our concept of total giving. It analyzes different multi-departmental collaborations among companies, other types of donations that typically are not counted.
So that's an excellent reminder. Thank you, Andre. We do not have it in our handouts, but it is available on CECP's website. The report you're looking for is S in the ESG. ESG, of course, standing for Environmental, Social, Governance.
Yeah.
So that report is talking about, and it has actually many pages of case studies and how companies are doing incredible work in measuring and in employing and executing programs that are so-called charitable and good. So, that would be a great resource, and that's part of also contacting us. So if there is a need for some additional information, clarification, or even customized data services and benchmarking, CECP is here for you. And of course, we cannot end the webinar without thanking our sponsors for this year's report: Citi, Newman's Own Foundation, PwC, Travelers, USAA. With 1 minute left, Andre, any closing words for those who are joining us today?
Thank you all for your participation, and we really encourage you to ask more questions or any doubts or any other thoughts you may have about how to increase corporate societal engagement among your companies. We're here for you.
Right, and this report is as strong as the input we get from our audience. So thank you so much for joining us. Hope you enjoy the day, and we look forward to connecting soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.